I didn't set out to collect the Olympics. And I certainly didn't set out to collect the 1920 Antwerp Olympics. Matter of fact, as far as I know, with the exception of Lawrence Jonker, who's a Dutch Olympic collector and who's specialized in the Amsterdam Olympics that followed the Antwerp Olympics and is a real specialist in these two Olympic philatelic discussions. With the exception of that, I don't know anybody that really does collect this particular set of stamps enthusiastically. They're far from the most beautiful stamps issued for the Olympics. And for reasons that you'll see, the whole process was quite rushed and is not particularly elegant. The reason I ended up collecting them is because when I started to collect Belgian stamps in 20-ish years ago, 15, 20 years ago, I met this wonderful man who was a great inspiration to me. And he said to me, well, what are you going to focus on? And I said, I don't know. I think they're all quite beautiful and I'm really interested in them. And he said, no go, you can't do it that way. You've got to focus on something. You're just going to wander and be lost. And so I decided to focus on the stamps of the kind of period right after World War I, because I knew that my grandfather had been there in the American Expeditionary Force, the Johnny-come-latelys to World War I. And he had talked a lot about his experience in and around Antwerp and in the kind of northeast of Belgium during the war. So I became interested in that. And little by little, this became a focus for me. Partly because, as you'll see, it's not only philatelic, it's also sociological and historical. And so I find that combination to be fascinating. All right, so here we go. The 1920 Olympic Games were the first ones to take place after World War I. The last Olympics had happened in 1912 in Stockholm. Those were the famous Olympics of Jim Thorpe, who dominated by winning track and field, by winning both the pentathlon and the decathlon in one Olympics. And of course, he's a famous and tragic story because later he was stripped by the Olympic Committee because he had played minor league baseball and he was stripped of his medals. The 1916 Olympics were supposed to take place in Berlin, but for obvious reasons with the war, they didn't happen. Originally, the 1920 Games were supposed to take place in Budapest, but of course, Budapest was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and an ally of Germany. And so when the war was over, there was not a lot of enthusiasm for rewarding Hungary by allowing them to have the Olympics. So that quickly passed aside. They were awarded to Antwerp remarkably, or to Belgium remarkably, because it was thought of as a compensation for the suffering that the Belgian people had taken place at the hands of the German occupiers during the war. There's a famous story of King Albert being contacted by the German envoy to Belgium, and Albert was asked if the German army could pass through Belgium to attack France from the north. And Albert said famously, "I rule a nation and not a road. The answer is no." And about 7 days later, the Germans attacked Belgium at Liège, and it was a very nasty situation, and they made the Belgian nation pay a great price for it. Although historians now believe the rape of Belgium, as it was called in a famous British report, is probably somewhat exaggerated, and that a lot of the things were done for a kind of the histrionics of it and the political and patriotic sense that they would rouse in people to come defend Belgium. Anyway, so little historical background. As you can imagine, most of the people who were involved in these Olympic Games had been in one way or the other either involved in or affected by World War One. The German well, we'll get to that in a minute. 29 nations took part in total, about 2,700 athletes in 22 sports. Amazingly, only 60 of these were women, and all of those, with one or two exceptions, were involved in swimming and diving. Uh, Pierre de Coubertin was very much against the inclusion of women in the male fraternity of gentlemen athletes. The performances at the Olympics in 1920 were considerably lower than they had been in Stockholm. And I mean, that obviously makes sense when you think that many of the great athletes had been killed during the war or wounded. The athletes that remained that were world-class athletes had really spent no time in 5 years preparing for the event, and so it's not a famous Olympics for its athletic performances. The decision was made almost immediately to ostracize the Germans and the members of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I think you can argue in our time of slightly less radical political thought that the Olympics of peace might actually have included those nations as well. But if you think about the fact that the war had basically only ended 18 months or so earlier, the idea of people cheering for the very people that they had fought this bloody war against is probably a bit of a stretch. However, the decision was made to hold the conference of reparations at Spa, which is reasonably close to Antwerp, and it was held contemporaneously with the Olympic Games. And on the left is a cover sent to the Committee on Reparations, which I think shows in some regard the fact that this conference was placed where it was placed to embarrass the Germans and their allies even further by being excluded from the Olympics. Of course, there was the Spanish influenza pandemic. They didn't understand it, and people are going to say the same thing about us, I'm quite certain. Can you imagine that they thought that it was, transmitted this way, and they did this? But at the time, people didn't really understand what was going on. A lot of the athletes were nervous about it, but went anyway. There was some Spanish flu going on after the Olympics were over, and it's reported that 7 of the athletes died from Spanish flu after the event was over with. Attendance at the games was pretty light, partly because it was very cold and rainy, but also the tickets were very expensive, and the average Belgian didn't have money to spend on things like the Olympic Games. The actual only 2 events that the community seemed to care about were the football or soccer championship and the bicycle racing, which attracted great crowds. The organizers were also very much against the press. They thought it was tacky and not in keeping with the high standards of the games to have people reporting on it. So they actually excluded the press from a good number of the events. The late decision to hold the games meant that Antwerp, which had basically been flattened during the war in great part, had to rush to construct a venue for these things to take place. So they built a lot of the structures on top of the foundations and ruins of other buildings that had been there. The stadium existed to some extent because it was outside this immediate part of the city. The most famous structure is the swimming venue. You can't see it under the picture here, but this is the diving platform here, and there were no lanes. There also was no turning lane. In other words, it wasn't 50 measure lengths. It was actually the proper length for whatever event was taking place, 100 meters, 200 meters, because this was constructed out of the moat of the old citadel, which was spring fed. And you can just imagine the water temperatures, as we'll talk about a little bit later on, were quite cold on a rainy August. I love Duke Kahanamoku, who you may remember if you used to watch The Wide World of Sports on Saturday afternoon. Every year they would have the Duke Kahanamoku Surfing Championships from Oahu and Hawaii. But Duke Kahanamoku was not only the father of classic surfing, he also was a multiple gold medal winning Olympic swimmer as well. And he has the best quote about swimming in the moat, which was the swimming venue. He said, the only thing faster than the American swimming team were the Belgian rats that regularly swam next to us. That gives you some idea. The Americans and Australians both complained bitterly about the temperature of the water. And during the final water polo match, 2 players had to be taken out of the water because they were experiencing hypothermia. So it was quite a situation. There were other challenges. If you were coming from North America, the shipping, the luxury cruise ships had only resumed at about 40%. The American team was shipped on 7 different ships, including this transport ship known as the Princess Matoika, which was at one time a luxury cruise ship, but had been used largely to transport dead bodies back from France. And during the course of the sail across, the American athletes memorably mounted what they called the mutiny on the Matoika, and swore that if the conditions were not better when they got to Amsterdam, that they would refuse to participate. The housing in Amsterdam was not better. Many of the buildings still didn't have electricity. The windows were blown out. Most people, with the exception of the women teams, were housed in subpar situations. There was not enough food. On several days, the American team complained about the fact that their breakfast was a slice of bread and a stale sardine, and that was all there was. We talked about the rats and the hypothermia, so not an easy situation. There was also considerable anger on the part of some European teams that they were being housed in things like these barges that were down at the Bonaparte dock in Amsterdam. They turned out, actually, the Dutch team memorably mounted a challenge about this. They turned out to actually be better housed than most of the other athletes, although they weren't aware of it. There were a bunch of new traditions that took place at the Amsterdam Olympics. The first time that the Olympic flag was flown was at Amsterdam. Pierre de Coubertin had conceived the idea. We all know the ring with its 5 rings with different colors. But it had never been flown before. The Olympic Committee in Belgium thought it would be a nice touch and tribute to him. This is a wonderful picture. I think about 5 years ago, or maybe 6, 7 years ago, this man discovered that he still had the Olympic flag in his closet. He was the one that had raised it at the ceremony as a little boy, and he took it out, and it was sold, I think, for close to $100,000. So that's the original flag boy. The Olympic oath was administered for the first time at the Amsterdam Olympics. And medals had been awarded earlier, but never in the shape of gold, silver, and bronze. So this was the first time that 3 medal levels were issued. This is a participation medal, which I'm happy to own. I can't afford a gold, bronze, or silver medal. They start at about $4,000, and that's a little bit outside my budget. For Canadians, of course, it was the first time that there was an international hockey tournament. Yes, it was the Summer Olympics, but skating and hockey took place in April before the official beginning of the games. The Canadian hockey team, which was drawn from Winnipeg and was made up largely of immigrants from Iceland, had only one goal scored on it in the entire series and destroyed, I think it was the Swedes 13-1 in the final game. And they were lauded, by the way, for their gentlemanly play instead of against the Europeans who, as one commentator said, played like a bunch of thugs. There was a famous famous soccer event. The final gold medal game was supposed to take place between Belgium and Czechoslovakia. The Czechs did not like the referee that had been appointed. They felt he had dealt badly with them in an earlier game. So things degenerated very quickly. They were angry on several calls. They got in a fist fight with the Belgian team, and that subsequently ended up with the Czech team attempting to beat up the referee and walking off the field in disgust and refusing to play the rest of the game. It's a wonderful picture. That's the Belgian team on the left there, and that's the Belgian crowds celebrating after the game was over. For those of you that may remember the stories of the flying Finns, this was the first Olympics that Paavo Nurmi ran at, and that's a cigarette card of Paavo Nurmi. And of course, we've talked about Duke Kahanamoko, who won several gold medals. This is one of my favorite pieces because it combines several parts of my interest in collecting Belgium. This is a travel card, an identity card, which permits Joseph Pearman, who was a 10,000 meter walking participant racer, to travel at half price on Belgian on the Antwerp travel, but it's canceled with a really lovely Antwerp rail cancel, which, as you know, my other passion is Belgian rail cancels. So the games were opened by King Albert on August the 20th, and the closing ceremony took place on the 12th of September. This is an original program from the event, which has nothing to do really with our presentation. I just like it very much and wanted to include it. To aid in the publicizing of the games, to get to the philatelic aspect now, the Belgian government made the decision to issue 3 commemorative stamps as a way of advertising. They weren't the first country to do this. In 1896, the Greeks had issued 12 commemoratives for the first modern Olympics, which took place in Athens. Remember that picture with the discus thrower on it. It will become or that stamp with the discus thrower. It will become important later on. The first person to suggest the idea of stamps was Gaston Stellan, who was a designer and the chairman of a charity which supported wounded war veterans. And he suggested that a stamp might be issued with a surcharge that would go to support the charity. And my apologies for the fact that this has Almy written all over it. It's the only picture I can find anywhere on the internet of Gaston Stellan, and I wasn't going to pay Almy thousands of dollars for it. So I assume responsibility if the club is contacted by Almy. So the idea for the postal issues began with Stellan suggesting the production of one stamp, a 10-centime issue, which featured the quadriga that pulled chariots during the Roman races. He was inspired by these horses, which were from St. Mark's Church in Venice. The idea wasn't enthusiastically embraced by the committee that was the government committee because they felt it was too close to a stamp that had been issued for the Greek Olympics, which I think you can see based on those. It's reasonably, they were actually accurate about that. So in August 1919, the Minister of Public Works, Rankin, wrote to the Belgian Olympic Committee and asked them if they would be interested in supporting this idea. The committee replied that they only had two requirements. One was that the stamp be based on classical themes, in keeping with the idea that this was the rebirth of the modern games again, and that the stamp contain the name of the city of Antwerp. That's the Belgian Olympic Committee on the right. Georges Montagnès, who was the designer of some of the most beautiful Belgian stamps of this period, one of which is on the right, was asked to submit a design. They really wanted him to do it, but he declined because the turnaround window at this point was only something about 14 months, and he didn't think it would be possible to produce a quality product in that shorter window, so he declined. The Dutch firm of Enschede, who is one of the leading European houses for producing stamps, was asked as well, but they were busy producing the tin hat stamps, the famous tin hat victory issue stamps, which are on the right. Didn't think that they would be able to do it. Ultimately, they submitted 3 designs quickly from antiquity, but they weren't used. So remarkably, the final design was produced by the American Banknote Company of New York, which seems like a very unusual place for these stamps to be produced. In the Belgian Postal Museum, a letter from December 13th sent by the Director General of the Post agrees to the purchase from the American Banknote Company of 5 million copies of each stamp. So of each of the 3 stamps they decided on, at the cost of $7,500. There's a memo that suggests that the government was very worried about the cost of this. And that it weighed heavily on the Ministry of Public Works, but they were finally convinced to go ahead and do it. The deciding factor for going with the American Banknote Company, if you look at the figures in this bottom bullet here, is probably the fact that the American Banknote Company came in with the cheapest design, considering the financial concerns that they had. Waterloo and Enschede both came in at considerably higher cost than the American Banknote Company did. This is a rare unused essay for the 5 centime stamp. For a long time, it was thought that there was absolutely no production material available for this issue. We don't know who the designer was. There aren't a lot of essays. There are not a lot of production die proofs and color proofs. There are a few, but not many. But this one surfaced when the American Banknote Company archives were auctioned off. Here's an essay for the 15 centime marathon runner, which is basically taken from a card or artwork, that a pre-existing artwork, and they simply changed, you can see the knee and the hair and the left arm. I ridiculously bid on this recently when it came up on the David Feldman Olympic auction. I put in what I thought was a really good bid on it, only to discovered that it had eventually gone for 15,000 euros. So my bid wasn't nearly as close to successful as I'd hoped it would be. This is early engraved die proof for the 15 centime issue. You can see if you look back that they actually stuck with what they decided. But beyond this, there exists a really remarkable photo proof, which shows the revisions that the final stamp design adopted. About 5 years ago, really sadly for me, this came up on eBay, and it was offered for $200. and all it said was photo proof of Belgian stamps. And I missed it. And it's the only actual production document that exists. And it went for not much more than that. I think it went for $500 or $600. So I was very sad to miss that. And here's a proof in dark sepia on card. I was lucky enough, however, to find 2 die proofs for the approved and altered final version of the stamp. It was thought that these didn't exist, and the only copies that did exist were in the Antwerp, what used to be the Philately Museum. But last summer, I was searching, as I do every day, for material on this, and I saw that someone had listed on Delcamp Belgian Olympic stamps printed on card. And I won't tell you what the bid started at, but nobody seemed to pay any attention to them. So I was really lucky to get a hold of these. As far as anyone knows, there is not a die proof for the 10-cent centime quadriga, but these 2 do exist, and I'm really happy to own them. Okay, after seeing the proofs, the Minister of Public Work believed the stamps would be a great success with the public. So he made what was a colossal misjudgment. The American Banknote Company said, why buy 15 million stamps if they're going to be popular when you can buy 30 million and we'll give you a 10% discount? And he said, wow, this is such a great idea. I'll go ahead and do it. And they got 10 million of each particular issue of the stamp. And only 10% of those were actually sold during the initial period before they were voided and taken off sale. They came up with the creative decision to overprint all of them at 20 centimes, which was the new internal letter rate, which came out in 1921 in Belgium. And they sold those 29 million stamps for the next 10 years until 1931, when they were finally invalidated for sale. So it was a real disaster in terms of the initial. The stamps were transported from New York on the Red Star lines and arrived in April and May of 1920. I don't own this, but this is a very rare wrapper sheet of one of the, of part of the order that came. That's in the collection of Lawrence Yonker. So those are the final designs and the 3 issues, the 5-cent discus thrower, the 10 centime quadriga, and the 15 centime marathon runner. The stamps were printed in sheets of 100. The margins include the inscription of the American Banknote Company in the color of the stamp. The plate number is printed strangely for reasons that no one has actually been able to understand, backwards on the front of in the margin. So it would be 1A instead of A1, and it's an inverted printing, and it isn't clear why that happened. You'll occasionally see these listed on Delcamp and Hipstamp as plate number inverted, but actually they're all inverted. So it's not nearly as special as it seems. And then they also have Depot 1920 added in black, which was the year they were deposited. Okay, the stamps were produced extremely quickly, and because of this, the quality of the issue, well, doesn't often suffer. It almost always suffers. The perforations are terrible. The American Banknote Company was still hand placing the sheets on the perforator. They were evidently under tremendous stress to get them done quickly. And it's virtually impossible to find a beautifully centered copy of these stamps. They're it's very hard to do it, and very often the perforations go into the frame of the actual image. It also contains a mistake which no one caught until after the stamps were printed. They're listed as the 7th Olympiad of 1920. The Olympic Games are their own thing. The Olympiad is the period between 2 Olympic Games. So that's a consistent error on all of the documents, all of the stamps as well. The stamps were surcharged 5 centimes. And that was a lot of money for people who were trying to recover from a war. And the belief is that that is probably one of the major reasons why the average citizen didn't buy these. So they were outside of the means of all but the most wealthy. And as we said, in the end, only 10% of the 30 million, not 3 million, that's a mistake, were actually sold. One of the things that you can always be on the lookout, which is one of the rarer parts of this issue, if you ever come across the original issue not overprinted with the 20 centime overprint, but the original version of the stamp with perfins, these stamps are almost never found as perfins, partly because companies don't like to pay a 5% surcharge for charitable purposes when they're not receiving a benefit for it. So these stamps as perfins are very, very unusual. I've only ever seen 7 of them, but if you find one, they always go cheaply because people don't think they're worth anything. Okay, there were not a lot of imperforates. Only 300 were released to the Belgian government to be distributed. Ultimately, there were 150 sets made, 150 of which were in the American banknote archives that were purchased. And there are a few imperf blocks of 4, but not many of them. The 5 centime covered the rate for a visiting card. A visiting card is a postcard with a 5-word message. That's it, no more. And it also went for matter that was printed matter weighing between 25 and 100 grams. The design is based on Myron's Discobolus, which is a copy, the most famous copy of which is in the Vatican Museum. And I started to look for stamps because I realized the 1932 American Los Angeles Olympic stamps also use this, the Discobolus. And I was astounded to find that that image appears on over 250 sports stamps. And it makes a nice little collection if you're looking for them. None of them are particularly expensive. So there's the Discobolus. I think they did a nice job of replicating that. That's the one that also appears on the 1896 Athens issue. As far as I know, there's only 1 full sheet of these. I don't own it. It's very hard to exhibit it because it doesn't fit on an 8.5 by 11 page. This is in the collection of Lawrence Yonker as well. Yeah, so we've talked about that. That's fine. The 10 centime was used for the internal postcard rate and eventually for foreign postcards as well, but not in the beginning. And the 15 centime covered the rate for an ordinary internal letter weighing up to 20 grams. And there's the marathon runner. So here are the overprints. We've talked a little bit about them. We don't have to say much else. I'll warn you that you will occasionally find the overprints inverted at the top of the stamp. Those are very, very rare. There's 1 sheet of the 5 cent and 1 sheet of the 15 cent that's known that was caught. The mistake was caught right after the first sheet. They're always not always, but they're very regularly counterfeited. So I've tried to buy 7 of these in the last 5 years, and I always make the same deal with people. I'll buy it at your price if you'll get a certificate for it. If the certificate is accurate, I'll pay for it. If the certificate says it's a forgery, you pay for it. And in all 7 cases, they've been forgeries, so I don't have the invert. So they were offered from sale from the 20th of May to the 30th of October and validated for sale on January 15th, 2021. Occasionally, you'll find these with earlier dates, not very often, but earlier dates than that. The Belgian postal system, like a lot of European governmental systems, seems to have offices which were not particularly tightly run. And so rather than insulting someone and telling them that their stamp couldn't be used yet, they just let it slip through. And you will occasionally find one of those. Originally, commemorative stamps were not allowed to be used on international mail, according to the UPU. So it wasn't until August 1920 that they were approved for use on mail to France, UK, Switzerland, the Belgian Congo, and Rwanda. And then you begin to see the UPU specimens, which were sent out. In October that year, they were also included, strangely, to Italy, Japan, the US, and Australia, but never to Canada. So you can find some really interesting usages, illegal foreign usages of these that slip through, such as this beautiful example, which is the only known example that made it to Brazil, long before the dates that they were supposed to be used. That's a beauty. I love that one. Now, the advertising cancellations, which are really the most important part of this, and we'll move quickly through this, I promise. The advertising cancellations are the reason this Olympics are important. The stamps had been done in Athens. They were not the first ones to do it, but they were the first ones to make large-scale use of cancellations for advertising. They were issued in the five major Belgian cities: Ghent, Antwerp, Liège, Charleroi, and Brussels. There's the cities. You'll see the dividing line between Flemish speaking to the north and French speaking to the south happens kind of right around Brussels, and this will be important in a minute. This chart, which we don't really need to go into in any detail, shows the last day of use for these and how long they were issued. So they were not used for very long. The longest use is 104 days in Liège. They were reasonably quickly dispensed with. You will see that a couple of these are slightly more scarce than the more common ones, which are listed as 1. And the absolute granddaddy of these is the Ghent 1 cancel, which is 20 times rarer than the most common ones. I also have, you'll see Charleroi is second, which is 5 more times rare than the common ones. I actually have more trouble finding the ones from Charleroi and have difficulty finding them used on stamps, as cancels on stamps. The Olympic cancel seems to have been used in Charleroi most often as a receiving cancel. I was very excited a couple of weeks ago I was going to share this the other night at the West Toronto Stamp Club, your interesting things and resolutions that you found. I bought a cheap Charleroi card online, only to find out that it was the earliest known usage. It's listed as July 20th. And it's a very rare example of a cancel on a stamp and not as a receiving mark. French dominant areas were Brussels, Charleroi, and Antwerp. Liège, sorry, and the Flemish dominant, Dutch dominant, were Antwerp and Ghent. This makes a difference because if you look at the top, you'll see that in the Flemish-speaking areas, the top line is in Flemish. In French-speaking areas, the top line is in French. So there's a distinction made between the two. So just quickly, we talked about the Ghent 1 cancel and why it's so scarce. I was able to do some research online in the Belgian archives. People have suggested that one of the reasons that this is such a rare cancel is because so few Olympic events took place in Ghent. There was only a qualifying tournament for soccer, and nothing took place in Charleroi, and that has always been given as the reason. But I found some really interesting things in the archives that prove a slightly different story. This is the Ghent 3 post office, which was located at the train station, the primary train station. This one down here is the Ghent 1 post office, which is the administrative post office and much further off the beaten track. When I looked into the amount of mail that went through these, I discovered that the Ghent post office had almost 39% less mail run through it than the Ghent 3 post office at the train station, which makes sense. It was the administrative center. It was located in the former mercantile and market area, but things had changed at that point down there. And the majority of people coming into Ghent came in through the post office. And if you're carrying a postcard, where are you going to drop it? In the post office at the train. And the same thing turned out to be the case for the Brussels 1 administrative and Antwerp 1 administrative offices, which are the two least interesting and most common cancels. So here's an example of the Ghent 1 cancel. We've talked about the inverted the inversion of the language. Very simple, nothing particularly spectacular or beautiful about it. Again, the mistake about the Olympiad rather than Olympics. There are only 20 of those known to exist. You will occasionally find errors on these as well. This is a consistent error on this particular card at the Antwerp 1, on the Antwerp 1 cancel, which is septembre is misabbreviated as septembre with an S instead of a B. You'll occasionally find a missing year on these. The misspelling of the version of Brussels, which should have an E here and which is an L, that's a consistent variety. Occasionally there'll be a missing dash between the numbers. That's a little bit more common. And this is one of my favorites. It appears that the Brussels North Post Office wasn't run quite as tightly administratively. The same thing happens with railroad cancels. There are all kinds of slipshod placements of numbers, days, and all of that. This is one of my favorite, where the Roman numerals for 11, actually that's 2 obviously, but the Roman numerals to make up 11 are substituted for the Arabic numbers. And that's a fun one. There also was a circular date stamp, which was available only during the Olympic Games themselves at the actual stadium. This is a very beautiful example of this. There are not very many of these known. 15 to 20 is the maximum. And that's a beauty because of, it's obviously philatelic, but that's a beauty because it also contains the stamps. Then there were vignettes and postcards. This is the official poster for the Antwerp Olympics. I think it's very beautiful. However, it made the mistake of being entirely too small, so it didn't attract a lot of attention. It was eventually turned into a postcard, which I think is much more successful. And it also was used for a vignette. which was produced rather quickly. No one really knows who printed it, how many were printed, but an advertising vignette, which I think is quite handsome. And those are available in 5 colors. The rarest of the bunch is the one in the middle. The kind of rust-colored one is very hard. They're all hard to find, especially in good condition. These would be considered extremely fine examples of these. Most of them are badly perforated and off center, but the rest one is surely the most rare. The Swiss wanted to issue a stamp to help fund their participation at the Olympic Games, but there's a Swiss law which says that no Swiss stamp will be issued for any event which takes place outside of Switzerland. So they weren't able to do it. Instead, they came up with a commemorative postcard, the funds for which went to support the Swiss team. This was also issued as a vignette or a Cinderella. There was a competition held where they very clearly suggested what they wanted. This is the only other example which is known, and I really like this one a lot because I think the person at the top looks more like Beavis from Beavis and Butthead than he does like a Roman lancer, and that's a really fun one and quite rare. It's hard to find those. To find the vignette used with a Swiss stamp on that postcard is also very difficult. There were a beautiful set of postcards produced by the Verelst company. I think there are 10 of them, all in. This is the only one I own. They're wonderfully turn of the century, and they're kind of Austrian Viennese style. They're really very beautiful, but they're also incredibly expensive, and they're very hard to find. A complete set of them is probably $7,000 or $8,000. So those are not in my collection, but they're really quite beautiful. And then there's this vignette as we come to the end now, which is always passed off by sellers and agents as a vignette for the Antwerp Olympics, but actually it was the vignette produced when Budapest was actually lobbying to have the games in Budapest. And on the bottom it says, make this a Hungarian Olympics. But it's a beautiful stamp just the same. Hungary also produced some beautiful matchbox labels, including the picture at the top, which is from the opening ceremonies, and the Finnish shot put thrower, Porhola. And then there's the holy grail of Olympic philately, which is so rare that I actually can't even find an image of it. They say you can find anything on Google. They're quite wrong about that. It was a registration label of which only 600 or so were sold at the Olympic Stadium. And I've never seen one. I've never seen one come up for auction. And I look every night before I go to bed, but I've yet to find one. So those are the registration labels, which are basically just an Antwerp label, but with Olympic Games printed over the top of in handwriting. Last thing, a commercial. If you're interested in any aspect of sports philately whatsoever, and you don't know about Sports Philatelists International, it's a wonderful group that's been around for many years. They produce a world-class journal called the Journal of Sports Philately, and it is a really wonderful group of people, and it doesn't cost much to join. And I'm go to their journal regularly. There's about 60 years of it on online. So anyway, that concludes the presentation. I hope you're still awake, and if not, you have someone to get you to bed. So